heard about probability models. We heard about neural networks. Now we would hear about probability models meet neural networks. David Duvenaud,
Thank you, David. Yeah, and thanks for the introduction, and also thank you for providing a primer on stochastic variational inference, because this work is directly building on that work. So also I have to say that this is joint work with Matt Johnson, Alex Wilchko, Bob Data, and Ryan Adams. These three are now at Google. Really, this is the brainchild of Matt Johnson. He deserves most of the credit here. We were both postdocs with Ryan for the last 2 years, and he came in all excited about linear models and MCMC and structured sort of switching linear dynamical systems. And I was all excited about variational autoencoders, saying this is the future. We can finally really actually use latent variable models. And then it was we kind of had all this back and forth about the pros and cons of these different approaches. And then in the end, we had this sort of synthesis. It's sort of like my chocolate and your peanut butter combine. So we're going to sort of try to motivate that this can give you the best of both worlds. Okay. I'm also going to motivate all this work with a practical problem, which is coding mouse behavior. So behaviorists and sort of neuroscientists have to do experiments to mice where they want to see what the effect on their behavior is, which involves like putting a fox odor inside of an enclosure or genetically modifying a mouse or doing something to its brain, and then seeing how its behavior changes. And then one inner loop of this sort of experiment is that a grad student needs to watch hours of this sort of video and code, okay, now the mouse was sort of interacting with other mice, now he was sleeping, now he was running. And this has high sort of intra and inter-coder variability, and it's a huge amount of work. And there's all sorts of sort of scientific pipelines that involve these human labeling tasks that we would like to automate. And if you watch enough of these videos, you'll see that, okay, maybe one way to characterize the mouse's behavior is as a sort of sequence of sort of mini actions or like behavioral phonemes. The idea being that, okay, now he's sniffing, then he stands up, then he maybe runs across, cleans his nose. And some of these are very short timescales and maybe even hard for a human coder to handle. But the idea is that maybe a first approximation of characterizing the mouse's behavior would be to sort of have a clustering model of its actions. And right now we're starting from this raw video. So let's imagine what the most naive thing you could possibly do would be, which would just be to run something like a mixture of Gaussians on raw video frames. Okay. So let's imagine that we encoded every video frame as one sort of point in a high-dimensional space. And just for the sake of example, let's have a two-dimensional space. So if we do have such data, then we now have some unsupervised learning problem where we have to cluster this data. And if the data does form nice Gaussian clusters, we can run a mixture of Gaussians. Great. But the problem is that real data, we think, doesn't form these nice Gaussian clusters. In fact, a lot of work on sort of natural images makes us think that real data lies on low-dimensional manifolds in high-dimensional spaces. So here's some sort of toy data that we can say still has some sort of cluster structure, but the clusters don't have this nice Gaussian sort of shape or likelihood. And if we fit a mixture of Gaussians to this model, it'll do this horrible thing that sort of tiles the manifold with a whole bunch of little Gaussians. And, people actually have fit speech models where they had a mixture of something like 1 million Gaussians. And this does actually have good properties as a density estimator. It does eventually capture the true density of the data with enough clusters and enough data. But A, we might be worried about the inductive bias, like doing a bad job of modeling the actual shape. And B, we have lost the supposedly interpretable model of a mixture of Gaussians where the clusters mean different things. That meaning is totally lost, just because we applied sort of an inappropriate likelihood to our clustering model. So we might say, well, the problem is that our likelihood isn't suitably flexible. So let's imagine some sort of putting a neural network in there. So the idea is here is a Gaussian that's been warped by a neural network that we've learned in order to fit the data here using a variational autoencoder. And it does learn to fit the data very well. And the network has sort of captured the regularities here, and it has learned a multimodal distribution. But this information is somehow implicit in the model. So what we'd really like to do is somehow get the best of both worlds, where we can have a nice flexible density model and also have it discover this sort of interpretable high-level structure. Okay, so when I talk about interpretable structure in graphical models, this is just a slide to let you know what I mean by graphical models, just because for the younger people in the audience who maybe have only ever known deep learning, there was this whole sort of 20 years of explosions at NIPS of people saying, oh, here's an interesting type of structure I might have. Like latent Dirichlet allocation or something like that, or a mixture of experts. And then people worked out fast inference methods for those if they had sort of simple likelihoods that were somehow like conjugate. So let's talk a little bit about the pros and cons of this sort of old approach that maybe now looks like it sounds to be like forgotten by history and neural networks. So why did people like problems like graphical models in the first place? Well, yeah, number one, as I mentioned, they give us these nice interpretable structured representations. Two, they let us encode information into a model in a sort of straightforward way. For instance, if we had a time series model, we might want to put some sort of prior on the temporal dynamics of some process, which like in a linear dynamical system, you could look at the eigenspectrum of the transition matrix or something like that. And then we also end up getting a nice, exact inference gives us well-calibrated uncertainty, at least assuming the model is true. And now if the assumptions of our model are close to correct, then we can be both data efficient, like not need too much data to learn the parameters. And in the case where we have these nice conjugate structures, and the NIPS crowd has worked out a good inference algorithm, we have computational efficiency as well. Of course, the whole reason we don't like them is because they have to make these rigid assumptions in order to get this sort of computational efficiency. The idea is we might have to assume that our likelihoods are exponential family or Gaussian or something like that, which means that we end up doing feature engineering, which, as we all know, is like the past. It's sort of a horrible idea. We don't think that humans are especially good at this. And when we do end up adding some sort of non-conjugate scheme, we might have to do some sort of top-down inference. I mean, I'm talking here about sort of MCMC, where the idea is you propose an explanation for the data, see how well it fits the data, and then maybe randomly move around in the latent space of explanations, trying to find a match for the data. Of course, I don't include things like Hamiltonian Monte Carlo here. OK, so deep learning, obviously, top dog. But one sort of problem with it is that once you fit a neural network model, you end up with this sort of uninterpretable goo. Like as I said, the information that your model has extracted from the data is in those parameters somewhere, but you have to do a bunch of extra work in order to interpret it, as opposed to, say, like a mixture model where you can just look at the cluster assignments. It's not obvious how to parameterize these models. And of course, this is an art that people can learn. But if I want to say that, OK, my model has sort of, time scales varying at this length scale, or this many distinct clusters, or something like that, it's really unclear how to sort of design like a recurrent neural network to even have that sort of structure available to it. The other thing is, of course, we know, well, now we have some Bayesian deep learning stuff, but in general, it can require lots of data. Of course, the reason we like them is that they're flexible. They can fit anything, even high-dimensional data. They do the feature learning for you. And as we now have things like variational autoencoders, we can actually learn to do inference and have the neural networks sort of take some of the burden off of our inference schemes and actually look at the data and then directly propose a good explanation, right? So this is kind of like bottom-up inference. OK, so we can see that graphical models and deep learning aren't just good at different things. They're good at complementary things. So this slide was maybe funny like 6 months ago when we first made them. Maybe now it's not. It's a little more serious. But the idea is we're going to sort of like revive all the good properties of graphical models by adding neural networks in to sort of handle the parts that they don't handle very well. OK, so in particular, I'm going to propose that we keep our interpretable graphical models on some latent variables and then connect them to the sort of real messy data that maybe doesn't fit our assumptions so exactly with some huge neural networks. And if you want a sort of another motivation of why this is a good idea, this is already what we do in supervised learning, where if we have a sort of nonlinear or somehow complicated decision boundary, what the sort of layers of a neural network up to the last layer look like is some sort of transformation of the data into a space in which something like a logistic regression, which is just sort of like a softmax layer, would actually be able to handle the data. So here we're going to say that the neural network can be a bridge from some sort of non-graphical model-y, non-interpretable version of the data into some sort of nicer version of the data where the assumptions of the sort of structured model do hold, at least closer. OK, so going back to this mouse example, how could we build a model that would actually let us model this mouse behavior? OK, oops, whoa, sorry, that went crazy. OK. Okay. So again, I was saying that maybe we think that the mouse behavior is broken into these sort of behavioral phenomes, strung together, stringing together a few of these sort of stereotyped actions like running, grooming, or standing up. So we could say, okay, there is some latent variable which is discrete, which says which behavior is the mouse doing right now. And then this changes over some time scale. And of course, what is a behavior? It's the changing of your body's state. So the idea is, well, we should also add some sort of continuous variables to our model that actually represent, in a sort of low-dimensional way, what is the actual current physical state of the mouse. And the idea is that which behavior you're in will determine what is the transition dynamics of your continuous latent state, when you're in that behavior. Okay, any questions at this point so far? Okay.
I have a quick question.
Yep.
The intuition behind your plot so far kind of indicate that there needs to be a supervised signal and an unsupervised signal, right? You have these colored, funny shapes. And we know that if we had just one big collection of colored points, a neural network could probably do it. Is that the case, or could you do this in entirely?
So the question is, do you need some sort of supervised and unsupervised signal in order to actually distinguish, I guess, the different sort of clusters or something like that?
Supervised is the density, and the supervised is the color.
Right, and so for example, where did the colors come from in that spiral plot? And the answer is, we don't need supervised learning, and that plot was learned in a totally unsupervised way. Yeah, exactly. So this is the beauty. We're, by jointly learning everything together, we really can do what unsupervised learning sort of promised to do, which is to both fit the data and find an interpretation of it. Okay, and I'll come back to that example a little bit later. Okay, so then, this is just a motivation for why we might want such a model. So the thing is, even if we thought this was a good sort of latent description of the mouse, we wouldn't necessarily know how to connect that to actual pixels in some video of a mouse, right? So what we're going to do, so yeah, here's the discrete structure is Z, continuous structure is X, and we're going to connect that to the video with just, sorry, my clicker's going crazy. We're going to connect that to the frames of a video of a mouse by some giant neural network that takes in the continuous state of the mouse and then outputs sort of a Gaussian with a mean and variance. And of course, there's no reason why we like this Gaussian. In fact, probably today we would use some sort of more sophisticated likelihood, like a real NVP or a pixel RNN. But the point is that, conditioned on X, I can tractably evaluate this density, which is basically saying this mean would be like the mean image, and then this sort of diagonal covariance would say that, the mouse's image is somehow near that. So these means would sort of describe some low-dimensional manifold, and this says I can be near those. Okay, so this is sort of the standard model of a variational autoencoder, but I've sort of extended it to be recurrent through time and have two different types of latent state. But this is exactly the sort of model building that graphical models people love to do. So then now this is our generative model that's sort of a hybrid of graphical model and sort of neural network goo. Okay, and so just to sort of compactify notation so I can talk about how we're going to do inference. So this is the model that we're talking about now. Let's get rid of time for now and just sort of compactify everything into one time step. And then let's also compactify all of the latent structure into one set of discrete latent variables. And now this is the sort of set of models that I'm going to say is a really good modeling motif and also for which we can do efficient inference. So in particular, I'm talking about models in which there is some set of latent variables that have a joint sort of exponential family distribution and a conjugate prior. And this is most of the sort of graphical models that we know how to do efficient inference in fall in this scheme. And then the actual data here is going to be connected to the latent by some sort of neural network observation model, like the one I showed before. And we have a lot of flexibility there as well. Okay, so anyone can write down a fancy model. That's not cool, but what's cool is being able to do efficient inference in a fancy model. And again, we have all sorts of different structure. It's not clear that if we just threw this into like Stan or something, that anything sensible would happen. Okay, so this is going to be the sort of technical hairy part of the talk, explaining how we do inference. To warm up, I'm going to revisit what David Bly was talking about earlier, is how would we do inference if we actually had sort of nice conjugate observations. Okay, so let's go back to the situation where we're just doing inference in a Kalman filter or something like that, where we have latent Gaussian with linear dynamics and a linear Gaussian observation. Okay, and we can cast this in the stochastic variational inference framework that David Bly was talking about by saying that, well, we need to approximate a posterior on the latence and the transition dynamics with some sort of maybe factorized Q distribution. This is our variational posterior. And in particular, we'll have a lower bound that is a function of our approximate posterior. And this is just the elbow that we've seen a million times. Since I'm saying that all this latent structure is actually exponential family, there's a one-to-one mapping between these exponential families and their sort of natural parameters. So eta here are the natural parameters of these exponential families. So now I'm just going to rewrite our lower bound in terms of these natural parameters. And now the sort of stochastic variational inference trick says, oh, well, actually, you can usually exactly optimize the sort of local variational family. And then you can compute the gradients with respect to your global parameters. You can get actually the natural gradients very cheaply by just computing the expected sufficient statistics under your approximate posterior. And this is sort of going to be cheap by construction. The details here don't matter, but the point is that this is all nice and tractable. And in fact, it's even better than that. We can get an unbiased estimate of the gradient even just looking at a single data point at random. This is where the stochastic comes in. So this is a great regime to be in, if we can be in it, if we have this sort of nice, if our variational factors are also exponential family. Okay, and then just to show you what this looks like, because we're going to show you the more complicated version in a second. Here is us sort of doing inference on a particular data point. So we might start by sort of looking at the data, getting our evidence potentials for each data point through time, run some fast message passing algorithm that has been sort of worked out before, like forward, backwards, to actually compute the joint distribution conditioned on this evidence. And now we can easily compute the natural gradient by just evaluating the expected sufficient statistics of this sort of exponential family distribution. Okay, so that's sort of how we can do inference if this likelihood is conjugate. But what if it's not, right? And that's sort of the hard part of this whole setup, is what if we have some horrible, nasty neural network here? So the main idea here is to basically just pretend that our observations are conjugates to our model. So the idea is that we're going to have some sort of neural network, some recognition network, that for each frame looks at the data and outputs what is the sort of best possible conjugate potential that would actually sort of, if I did inference in my approximate posterior, give me something that was like a good approximation to the true posterior. Okay? So I'm going to break this idea down, and that's going to be sort of the hard part of the talk. Okay, so now the setting is we have our latent dynamical system, but with this neural network observations. And here, sort of gamma is going to be the parameters of this horrible generative neural network. And now we have to, again, approximate our posterior over our latent parameters, this neural network parameters, and the latent values. And of course, usually we'll just use a point estimate for gamma. Anyway, so the point is that now we have this elbow with this horrible non-conjugate term in here. And if we try to do the same trick, stochastic variational inference, we now have to sort of optimize some local Q distribution to sort of match what would be optimal under this sort of horrible non-conjugate thing. And there's no nice closed form for that. We could do some sort of stochastic optimization in an inner loop, but that would be slow. So what we're going to do instead is say that, well, okay, we would like to optimize this bound, but it's horrible. So, and the reason it's horrible is because this is sort of the probability of the latence given, this is the likelihood. So it's sort of like the probability of the data under different settings of the latence. There's no nice form here because some neural network is in the way. So let's just approximate this non-conjugate evidence with some conjugate evidence. And now, okay. Well, so the idea is that there's going to be a neural network that looks at every frame of the video. And says, okay, here is what the best sort of like Gaussian approximation to the evidence that that frame would give you is. And now let's ignore this sort of the elbow and construct this new nice elbow that is sort of the conjugate version of it that's easy to handle. So we're going to replace this horrible term with just exp of the conjugate potential for whatever our latent graphical model is. Okay, so again, we're actually not optimizing the original elbow. We're optimizing something different. And the only nice thing we can say about this different elbow is that if the observations were actually conjugate, this would be the right elbow. Okay. So we're going to say that our new elbow, this like SVE elbow, is sort of optimizing the this guy when the local evidence is sort of being approximately optimized by just a neural network outputting something that it thinks is approximately optimal. Okay, so this was like maybe the technical slog. Now let's zoom out again to sort of what the high-level algorithm looks like. So again, so we've sampled some data, like a time series from our data set. Now every frame of our video has a neural network looking at it and sort of summarizing it. And now we sort of throw away the original frames and we just have these sort of like local Gaussian potentials or something like that. Now we run our fast inference to combine this local evidence from every video frame into some sort of coherent story. So in every individual frame, we might be like uncertain about what the mouse's behavior is or something like that, or maybe it's a noisy image. We don't even know its location very well. But we can combine all that evidence automatically in some sort of coherent probabilistic framework using one of our fast algorithms. And now, of course, there's an extra step where we have to actually compute the gradients through the generative network and the recognition network. But we can do that with our sort of reparameterization trick and stochastic gradients. This is sort of like not tricky. And sort of the nice thing is that we still get natural gradient updates with respect to all of our latent graphical model parameters. Okay? So if we were just doing something like a variational autoencoder, we wouldn't get any natural gradients anywhere. And the neural network would have to learn how to combine evidence on its own instead of getting to reuse the sort of rules of probability.
Sorry, is the neural network being updated in step 3, the likelihood level neural network?
Yeah, so this is during training. So after step 2, we've already sort of computed our posterior. So at test time, maybe that's all we would need. But at training time, we also need to compute gradients. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, that was like a lot to digest. But maybe we can think about this algorithm in terms of its pros and cons against sort of other related approaches for handling this similar situation. So we can imagine doing natural gradient SVI where, as I said, instead of having a recognition neural network, we just do a local optimization at every step and try to find sort of the optimal Q for every data point from scratch every time we update the global parameters. So this is bad because it's expensive for general observations. We have to keep getting sort of evaluating our generative neural network every time we propose a different latent factor. But we do get the optimal local factor. And this is nice because it can exploit the conjugate graphical model structure. Like we can get exponential gradients and use fast message passing. And it supports arbitrary inference queries. So one thing we might want to do in a time series model is ask, well, do like filtering or prediction, or ask, what if I've missed these frames? Can you fill them in? And these nice, so that's one nice thing about SVI. Okay, and yeah, we get natural gradients. Okay, so there's sort of another sort of more brute force approach, variational autoencoders, which is use sort of the thing to do if you just are trying to make a model of like single images or something that you don't think has a sort of complicated latent structure, where we just have a neural network output the entire sort of Q distribution over all our latent variables at once. And this is nice because it's fast. We just ask our neural network to, in like whatever number of layers, output the approximate optimal factor. But of course, because the neural network isn't powerful enough, we won't be able to actually get the sort of exact optimal local factors. And we have to train a neural network to basically learn Bayes' rule in a particular model and all the possible ways that evidence can interact. Also, we can only ask it questions that we've trained it to answer. So if we wanted to say, okay, now we have only seen every second frame of our video, we would have to train another neural network to sort of handle that. And we don't get any nice natural gradients. So this sort of like in-between thing that we're proposing here, it's nice because it's still fast for general observations because the neural networks sort of summarize the data for us in sort of one step. And we don't necessarily get the optimal local factors, but we would have the optimal local factors if we had conjugate evidence. So if we actually had sort of the generative model matching the assumptions of the, being conjugate to the latent graphical model. And again, this is nice because it exploits our conjugate graphical structure. We end up with a nice non-factorized posterior. And again, we can support any inference query, like dropping random frames or something like that. And we also get natural gradients. OK, so I hope you believe me that we can actually do inference in these models. And now I'm saying that the nice thing about this recipe is that it's very general, right? It plugs into, I don't want to say any, but basically a lot of different scenarios where we've worked out some fast inference method for some graphical model. We can just now say, oh, and the thing connecting this latent structure to the data is some really rich deep neural network. So now we have sort of deep versions of everything that was done at NIPS for the last 20 years for free. Well, maybe that's, at least in principle. OK. So so here is us using this inference model to fit that model that I was talking about in the first slide. So here is our sort of synthetic data that I say has cluster structure but lives on sort of these non-Gaussian manifolds. And now here is our latent variables. So this is sort of the x that we were talking about. And the idea is that, in general, these won't be the same dimension. In general, this will be 1,000 dimensions, and this will be 100 dimensions. But just for visualization, let's say it's 2 to 2. And the idea is the generative model is a Gaussian mixture model in the latent space that is warped by some neural network into the observed space. And the recognition network is going to look at sort of each one of these points and output a sort of conjugate piece of evidence, like a Gaussian likelihood saying where it lives in the latent space and which cluster it belongs to. OK, so if we train during this model, we jointly learn the parameters of this latent graphical model and the mapping between them. Of course, it's hard to show the mapping. But this is really nice. So I was talking about early on is we can say that, we've transformed the data into this latent space in which it is a mixture of Gaussians. OK. And any questions about this example? OK. So just to show you that this isn't a one-trick pony, here is us learning a linear dynamical system, or rather a latent linear dynamical system, where the observations are sort of one-dimensional video frames. So this is time. And the idea is that this is a one-dimensional video of a ball bouncing back and forth, sort of exploded across time. So if you played this, it would just look like a little puck going back and forth. And we're going to give it, I think, a 2 or I think it's 4-dimensional latent space with which to model the dynamics using a linear dynamical system. And of course, there's obviously not a linear Gaussian relationship between this thing and the actual observations. OK, so when we train it, it's kind of nice. So actually, I want to pause right here. Let me go back. So first, oops, oh my God. Wait. OK, well, anyway, I can't pause it. But first, it learns to auto-encode the data. And then it learns to arrange the data in the latent space in such a way that it can be well modeled by linear dynamics. So, for those of you who haven't played with LDSs before, the evolution of the state is necessarily something like sinusoidal, just because we're applying some sort of linear transition. And this is kind of nice because even though the puck bounces up and down sharply, we can sort of, the generative neural network can learn to map from a sort of nice, smooth dynamics to something that matches the observations. And because we're being probabilistic, we have uncertainty about the future state. Oh yeah, I should mention that this red line means we're conditioning on the data up to this point, and then we're this is filtering, and then this is prediction. So we're a little bit uncertain about what the sort of exact sort of speed of the puck is. Yep.
Sorry, could you mention again, in the previous setting, how did you kind of know the number of components that should really emerge?
Great question. So the question was, in the previous setting, how did we know how many clusters should emerge? And the answer is, we don't. We just set it to be 15. And then the beauty of marginal likelihood is that it turns off clusters that you don't need. So we started with a whole bunch. And then the best fit to the data was one that only used 5. So we I don't want to be too Bayesian here, but this is why we like being Bayesian, right? Is because you can just make a huge model, and then it'll get rid of all the structure that it doesn't need, if optimization works.
You have like one of these priors that approximates a DP, and that's this?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
This example with the bouncing ball,
Mm-hmm.
did you compare it with just using a residual net or just Bayesian inference?
Just the residual net. Oh, you mean just the recognition network, like just the just a variational autoencoder that had to output? Well, okay, that's a great question. So the question is, well, did you compare against just using variational autoencoder? But think about what that would mean. It would mean that I would have to, for instance, learn a neural network that would take in this entire video, and half of it, and output this entire set of states. And now if I want to condition on a different amount of video, then I have to learn another neural network to do that. So this is already sort of showing why we don't want to learn a bespoke neural network for every task, because if I want to condition on some different sort of set of data, I would have to learn an entirely different recognition network. Also, the input size of that neural network would be huge, and the output size would be huge. But you're right that we could have just used like a recurrent neural network or something like that, which would have addressed most of these problems. I think a recurrent neural network could have been made to work as well, and it just wouldn't have trained as fast. We have some results on like how the exponential family, or the natural gradients rather, allow faster training. So, but you're right, that would be a very sensible baseline to compare against. Okay, this is an advertisement both for the model class, which would work with different inference strategies, and the inference strategy, which I'm just saying is faster than other inference strategies. Yep.
So you retrain the deep learning while you're doing all this Bayesian inference.
Yeah, exactly. So updating the parameters of the generative model and the recognition model involves one step of inference. So here I'm showing us training and then doing inference at each step as well. Okay. So now onto our actual real application. So I was sort of saying we want to cluster this guy's behavior into behavioral phenotypes. And so to begin with, we're going to make things a little bit easier on ourselves by not having that raw high-def video. And in fact, the mouse behavior is measured in the dark because they behave more naturally in the dark. So here we have a Kinect looking down on the mouse. And then to sort of pre-process things, we've built this sort of egocentric view where the mouse is sort of put into a fixed orientation and position within the within a box. Of course, in principle, the sort of recognition network and generative networks could learn this with like a spatial transformer thing, but this is just baby steps. Okay, and just to remind you guys, our model has the discrete part, the continuous part, and the sort of generative model. So here, the nice thing about generative models is that you can sanity check them by just generating model once you fit the data and seeing if it looks like the real data. So in each of these examples, we've trained the entire model. We've conditioned on the mouse behavior up until some time step. And then one row is the real data, the real sort of future course of that mouse. And then the other row is the synthetic data from our model. And I know that we sort of cheated by making the model low res, but I would say that it's pretty hard to tell. So it's actually the bottom is the real data, and the top is the generative data. But I would say that it's sort of close enough that you can't tell, or at least I can't. We can, of course, when we have a variational autoencoder with a continuous latent space, one fun thing to do is actually just sort of take a two-dimensional slice of that latent space and then generate data from it. And here we can see that, okay, in one, the actual latent space is like 30-dimensional, I think. But in this two-dimensional slice, you can see that sort of this side the mouse is scrunched up, and here he's sort of long. Here he's standing up. Here he's sort of laying down. Okay, and now for the interpretable structure part. So remember, we have this discrete latent variable that is changing sort of according to sort of hidden Markov model dynamics. Here is all the real data that most activates one of those latent sort of states after we train the model. So the dots turn on when we are in the part of the time series that is sort of like we've most activated this one cluster, and we've just named it rearing up after the fact. There was no supervision here. We've just trained on, I think, like, what was it? I think 10 million frames of raw mouse video. And the idea is this is a sort of sensible type of like behavioral phoneme that you would expect maybe a grad student to sort of find and sort of start labeling. And this was all done automatically. And we can look at all sort of, the different clusters that we find. So this one, all these mouse are doing different things, and then all of a sudden they just very quickly fall down from standing up. And yeah, I mean, I would say that that's like a pretty stereotyped behavior, even though they are like in slightly different poses and stuff like that. And then this is the last one. This is his grooming his tummy. OK, so actually, any questions about this application? Yep.
How does it compare with human labeling?
That's a great question. We haven't done that comparison. Yeah. Yep.
How many total states did it learn?
So we gave it 30 states to begin with. And I didn't actually look through the clusters. But again, I think most of them ended up not being used. But yeah. Again, it's one of these things where I'm not sure we need non-parametrics so much, because I think a lot of the time you can just say that, well, make my model some huge size, larger than I think it needs to be, and then the model will like not use the states it doesn't need to. OK. So that's the basic thing. To anticipate sort of one criticism that I had the whole time, and I was saying, why don't we just have neural networks everywhere? Why do we have to have this like linear latent structure? And obviously, nonlinear latent structure is sort of more expressive, and it definitely has a place. But maybe one thing we could say is that linear structure is maybe surprisingly, I guess I would say, expressive. For instance, all the word-to-vec sort of cute like automatic analogical reasoning, like king minus man plus woman equals queen. I mean, that's a linear operation in this latent space that does have this semantic meaning. So maybe, I was pretty skeptical of linear structure, but maybe more than I needed to be. Yeah, and I mean, we can also give them nonlinear latent structure either in the prior or in the approximate posterior or both, right? There's like a huge spectrum here. There's no need to make any hard choices. So maybe one thing that you might not like about these is complexity, right? And the beauty of deep learning is that once you have one of these nice automatic differentiation frameworks, then it's like almost like this hobbyist community can just spring up without having to have ever done a whole bunch of hard inference math. So the nice thing I would say about that is that the inference here is modular. And I didn't get into the details too much, but basically we need of our model to be able to compute samples from it, expected sufficient statistics, and some few different like Kale divergences. And that's sort of the only thing we need from our latent model. So that like the PGM guy can work out that model, and then it plugs into this whole framework. So yeah, and then places we might want to use this are things like model-based RL, where we might think that having a very low-dimensional latent space or somehow simple latent structure will allow like data-efficient RL or transfer learning or something like that. Of course, right now in this examples, I've always just handcrafted the model. But of course, I was saying humans are bad at feature learning. I think humans are probably also pretty bad at model design. So what we want to do in the future is, of course, automatically build the structure by doing some sort of automatic search. And of course, we have marginal likelihoods in all of this. So that means that we can use that as our sort of search criterion. And of course, we probably want to really use this for semi-supervised applications where we maybe can ground some of our latent symbols by having a human labeler label 1 hour of video, and then now the model just has to figure out what those labels actually mean in terms of pixels. OK, so I want to again point out that this is like Matt's baby, but thank you very much.
We have time for a few questions. Ben?
So how does it fit with GPU?
Oh, how does it fit with GPU? I mean, everything that happens in the generative network and the recognition network probably can and should be done on the GPU. I don't think that the latent inference is going to be a good fit for GPUs, though. But these happen sort of in alternating sequences. And of course, this is all stochastic. So I think that there's not like a bottleneck, right? I think we can sort of batch this up so that we can use the GPU pretty well. Yep.
I have a question about VAE in general. From the perspective of variational inference, the family that you get from VAE is less expressive than the VAE family.
Yeah.
So And you cited the speed, but is there something more? Is it, if you use just mean field Gaussians, would performance be as good or better? And is it just speed, or what's going on?
Yeah, okay, so the question is, if you just use mean field Gaussians everywhere, would the speed be better? I mean, I think,
No, would the fidelity be better and the speed be worse?
Oh, would the fidelity be better? I mean, the nice thing about this whole setup is that we get to have non-factorized posteriors. So, I mean, I would have to say, I assume the fidelity would be worse if we enforced that the latent variable is factorized across time or something like that.
Sorry, in the VAE, aren't you conditioning on X and then spitting out a collection of
Oh, I see.
variances? So that's factorized.
Yes. Oh, you mean, okay. Yeah, I guess there's different.
But it's not as expressive as the full mean field family where you can set each of those means and variances separately. So what I'm asking is the VAE giving us something more, or?
Well, I would say that in principle, the VAE can give us as arbitrarily good of a posterior as we want. So it can spit out sort of fully factorized Gaussians. It can spit out ones that factorize, but only sort of across two time steps, which I think is what you're saying. We can use like normalizing flows to give us sort of any, even more expressive posteriors. Yeah, I guess I would just say that we have to do a lot more learning in that case. So, yeah.
Thanks. Other questions? Okay, thank you.
Meet back here at 2 o'clock.
Meet back at 2 o'clock. You can rear up and go